Sergeant Charmin Leon has lived and worked in urban communities most of her life. She served as an assistant director of teen mentoring programs, served as a home detention officer for juvenile court, and a public assistance worker and system advocate for male victims of domestic violence. She joined the Cleveland Police Division of Police in February of 2008, working patrol in the 4th District, and was promoted to sergeant and investigated allegations of officer misconduct in the Office of Professional Standards. She also served as officer in charge of personnel and backgrounds and established and led the public safety recruitment team for police, fire, and EMS until her departure from the division in September of 2020. Sergeant Leon now works at the Center for Policing Equity, a research and action think tank that promotes police transparency and accountability through research, partnerships, and public discourse. Our next set of presenters will be Sean F. Barnes. Chief Barnes is the chief of police for Madison Police Department in Wisconsin. Prior to his appointment as chief in February of 2021, Chief Barnes served as director of training and professional development in Chicago, Illinois, and he was the former deputy chief of police in Salisbury, North Carolina. He was previously a captain with the Greensboro Police Department, where he began his career as patrol officer in November of 2000. He has vast experience in police leadership, serving as the commander of 4 police divisions. He also served in the Armed Forces as a United States Marine. Dr. Barnes attended Elizabeth City State University, where he received a BA in History and Pre-Law, and the University of Cincinnati, where he received a master's degree in criminal justice. He earned his PhD in leadership studies from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, where his dissertation focused on racial disparities in traffic stops and the role of police leadership in community engagement efforts. With him, we have a native of Dallas, Texas. Tariq Mcguire began a career in public service with the Arlington, Texas Police Department in 2003. During his tenure, he served in multiple positions before being appointed to Deputy Police Chief in 2018. As a nationally recognized public speaker and public author, Chief Mcguire has been a leading authority on community police relations, evidence-based policing, police reform, and improving public policy. In 2020, he was appointed to the Council on Police Reform and Race by the National Police Foundation out of Washington, D.C., and serves as chairperson for the International Association of Chiefs of Police Juvenile Justice and Child Protection Committee. During his career, Chief Mcguire has been at the forefront of developing innovative strategies, leading national change in community police relations, affecting lives globally. In 2016, Chief Mcguire served as Law Enforcement Fellow at the IACP, contributing research and technical assistance to the U.S. Police Departments on 21st Century Policing in Washington, D.C. And last but certainly not least, we are so grateful to have with us Craig B. Futterman. Professor Futterman is a clinical professor of law at the University of Chicago Law School and a resident dean in the college. He founded and has served as the director of Civil Rights and Police Accountability Project of the Mandel Legal Aid Clinic since 2000. He was elected to a Simon Visiting Professorship in the School of Law at the University of Manchester, UK in 2018-2019. Before his appointment to the law faculty, Professor Futterman was a lecturer in law and director of public interest programs at Stanford Law School. He previously joined Futterman and Howard, a boutique law firm concentrating in complex federal litigation. There, Professor Futterman specialized in civil rights and constitutional matters with a special focus on racial discrimination, education, and police brutality. Before that, he served as a trial attorney in the juvenile division of the Cook County Public Defender's Office. Professor Futterman received his JD from Stanford Law School in 1991 and graduated with the highest distinction from Northwestern University with a Bachelor's of Arts in Sociology and Economics. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists for our final panel of the day.
Thank you, Professor Hardaway, and Case Law School, thank you for having me. I'm going to start my timer, and I'm so glad I did this. I timed for 20 minutes my notes because I could go on for days about all of the wonderful information that's been shared today, so I knew better. And I'd like to welcome my co-panelists, especially from my hometown of Chicago. All right, born and raised Chicago, Illinois, so thank you. Again, as was stated, I'm Charmin Leone, and I'm currently a commissioner with the Cleveland Police Commission. I was, as mentioned, also I was formerly with the Cleveland Division of Police, and I'm now with the Center for Policing Equity, a research and action think tank that partners with law enforcement agencies across the country with the ultimate goal of reducing disparities in policing outcomes in Black and brown communities. So my title is Exploring Solutions. And when I hear exploring, it sounds like another conversation. Like, we don't have to have more conversations. If we had listened to Black and brown communities and just believed them, we would have been here 50 years ago, 100 years ago. But we need the science, we need the research to prove that Black folks know what they're talking about. And it's not just, victim mentality and folks who are lazy and don't want to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and if they live better and got married and had kids within, that kind of thing. The death by 1,000 cuts over and over and over again is just a bit much. So it has to look different, but the good thing and what keeps me buoyed is that we have moved beyond the conversations at this point. There's a lot of people doing the work. I love coming to conferences because then I remember I'm not alone in this work. With the Center for Policing Equity now, I know I'm not alone in this work, and I also know that it is possible for an agency to be a learning institution, a thriving organization, one that supports its people along with them doing difficult work. I know it's possible. So this has to look different, as everyone has said today. Policing has to look different. The Police Commission just completed a work regarding 100 years of reform here in Cleveland. It further highlighted the stops and starts of overhauling American policing. One of the biggest developments for our community in the last 7 years was the passage of Issue 24. Sergeant Jackson talked about that earlier, which gives greater oversight powers and makes the commission a permanent fixture. Since my days in the Office of Professional Standards, I have been a proponent of civilian oversight. A lot of my former colleagues questioned and didn't agree with this type of structure, which baffles me when the very authority we are given is given and should be governed by the citizenry. We only have our powers at the consent of the citizenry. It should be extremely telling when police officers say they don't want the citizens to oversee the work that they do, when the citizens are the ones that give us our authority, but we know what that's about. There is no national certification board for police, so municipalities are left to determine structures of policing for themselves. There are cons and pros to this. The cons being no nationwide standard, with hiring, with training, with organizational structures. We talked about that earlier. And in today's environment, however, the pros may very well be that those who have the appetite and the ability to weather the backlash that always comes on the heels for the calls for reform are able to, along with their communities and local governments, determine a path forward for themselves. It's even more of a pro when reform efforts on the federal level seem to always eventually lose steam because of renewed fear-mongering, we call it propaganda, to push back against reform. Many officers and the unions that represent them take reform as a threat to our authority, our claimed expertise, and more than anything, livelihoods. During my time as an officer, the calls for Back the Blue and Blue Lives Matter was in full swing. An officer asked if I was going to attend the rally 2 blocks away from our office downtown, to which I replied that I absolutely never would. that it broke my heart that we would participate in something that was created as a direct result of our communities asking that we acknowledge the harm over-policing does to the lives and families of our communities, and we were effectively sticking our thumb in their eyes and demanding that they see us instead. They see us every day. They actually know us a lot better than a lot of civilians who joined them in those marches. I was introduced to CPE while a certified instructor with the Cleveland Division of Police. I was one of the first instructors for procedural justice, implicit bias, and legitimacy. There, I saw the clip of Dr. Philip Atiba-Goff speaking about the science of bias, right-sizing the conversation from officers being inherently racist to the science of how our brains function in situations which are inherent in the profession of policing, being tired, being stressed, having to make time-bound decisions. It resonated with me because I worked with and came to know amazing men and women on the job and knew most did not have nefarious intentions against Black and brown communities when they applied for the job or when they came to work every day. So I really began following the work of CPE and advocating for the changes that would offset those risk factors that are inherent in policing. And one of the teachings in the procedural justice, implicit bias, and legitimacy, it talks about the triangle of stress for officers. You have the department, you have the street, and you have home, your family. Most officers' stress and trauma comes from the department. It does not come from the street. Most of us, can work the street in our sleep, not really, won't be awake, but we can do that all day long. It's the department. And so there's been a lot of conversation here today about addressing those toxic departments and the situational risk factors that are inherent in there that increase the likelihood of officers behaving in biased manners. I will send an email out after today with all the links to this, but if you'd like, take a look at Dr. Phil's TED Talk. The Center for Policing Equity was co-founded by Dr. Philip Atiba-Goff, who's a psychologist and on race and policing, and retired captain from the Denver Police Department, Dr. Tracy Kazee, one of my sheroes. And she was also the first Deputy Commissioner of Equity and Inclusion with NYPD. So, but when I worked and tried to work with the Cleveland Division of Police in my many different roles, and at the end, as the officer in charge of recruitment for police, fire, and EMS, I became frustrated with the seemingly inability of decision makers to address these issues that would lead to better policing by addressing the internal factors. Someone talked about the psychological background. We have that. It was trash. Everybody knew it was trash. We start working to get a new psych service. People feel like certain contracts are their right to their livelihood. So their livelihood is more important than the well-being of the community, so we have to fight through that. Cleveland has an ordinance on the books that talks about officers, all public safety, being reviewed every 2 years. They don't apply it. They don't apply it in practice. So that is there, and we're not utilizing the tools available to us in the regard. So when I did apply for Center for Policing Equity and was hired, they had just completed the creation of a new project called CompStat for Justice. Currently, it's our most comprehensive service offering to police departments. It's a partnership that lasts 3 to 5 years where we analyze their data, and then, along with a number of other qualitative analysis, we contextualize that data to pinpoint the most burdensome policing efforts that do not map onto public safety, but instead just serve to undermine law enforcement's legitimacy and trust in our communities. Other approaches to reimagining policing that's taking place across the states now, the cessation of low-level stops to burdensome policing. We talked about how disparate those are. Co-response models, where mental health workers either accompany or replace police in responding to these types of calls. One is called Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, where out of 24,000 calls for service, only a little over 300 required police presence. And that's real important. We talk about smart policing. Let's be smart about what we're doing. The first folks to talk about defunding the police were the police. We're like, get us out of these areas we don't need to be in. Stop having us, provide services we should not be providing. When someone talked about CIT and said there were officers that said, I don't care nothing about that. I'm not trying to do that. That's not what, yeah, right. So for those, stop it. Stop allowing our legislature to be lazy and not fund the supportive services that are necessary. Everybody's having a hard time recruiting now. Of course, people who are threatened by their livelihoods are saying it's because of the defund the police and backlash. Stop it? No, because they haven't been defunded. Cops are getting more money than ever, so we know that is not true. It's like it's false, right? But if we get out of those spaces we don't have any business being in, you might not need as many police as you think you do. And that's what people don't want to talk about, because this job is a right to some folks, right? Violence interrupters is another approach to reimagining policing, because we know violent crimes in communities are often committed by a small percentage of residents, and focusing on those most at risk and providing them supportive services are the approaches some communities are taking. There's also another article done about how many billions of dollars are saved when we divert folks from lives of crime and address it in a smart way using real data and science. As our areas are different with different histories, racial compositions, et cetera, there is no one model of public safety that fits every jurisdiction. So depending upon the leadership in these areas and whether or not their citizens are calling for a change in the way they approach public safety, they are able to reimagine what policing should look like for themselves. Center for Policing Equity also participated in work in Ithaca, New York, where they just instituted an additional department that addresses quality of life issues. A lot of burdensome policing lives in low-level offenses, where we as police throw a wide net, and many people caught in that net, in which the communities I've lived and worked in have been Black and brown people. Now, Ithaca is a city of 32,000 people with about 6% Black and brown communities. I'll also provide that link because it talks about now what the police department will respond to and what their community safety department will respond to. And as we always know, you have to, for some things it's case-by-case basis or what have you, but really taking police out of those spaces that can be better served by other support services. And I was ashamed to learn about the work going on down in Dayton, Ohio, because it's down the street. But they didn't, they took it upon themselves. The commission, the council there took it upon themselves to create police reform working groups. They imposed time-bound limitations on themselves to review and decide on those recommendations. They have a population of 140,000 people with about 38% Black and brown communities there. So I'm gonna send you the link, check it out. It is really, really amazing. I'm like, just so, go Dayton. So yeah, they did that thing. And they all worked together and did this for their community and held themselves accountable to being successful and reaching their goals. And so, yeah, that's pretty cool. So in summary, there is work being done. There is work being done. It's often bespoke on local and state levels because on the federal level, it wanes in the winds of our politics. As we know, overhauls were recently left out of the omnibus spending bill. And that's why many Black Americans remain doubtful on real police reform. So I always say, because this is an emotional labor, it is exhausting work. And oftentimes those who are most affected by the disparate outcomes are asked to show up, volunteer. This is no volunteer. Stop asking people to volunteer to do this kind of work. With the passage of issue 24, now Charter Amendment 1115, there's a stipend given. But again, the stipends ultimately, and I'm glad Judge Oliver made that acknowledgement, is still almost asking for volunteer. That is cruel and unusual punishment. And we know it's unfortunate. We are addicted to punishment in this country. We are addicted to incarceration. It's 1 in 5 in the world are incarcerated here in America. If that made us safe, we'd be safe. Pick an area and do your work. I have to compartmentalize to keep my sanity and remain effective. It's easy to get distracted and pulled into too many directions because it's all connected. But when I do too many things, I don't do any one thing well. We are constantly developing the appetite of chiefs to break from their past and embrace and employ proactive measures toward the future. It's not work for the faint of heart. When I feel weary, I think of those that came before me, where this work was a threat to their very life. And I get over myself. I think about people, another shero of mine, Sherilyn Eiffel, that has been at this longer than I and has been up close and personal to volumes more injustice than I ever have. And I get over myself. I think about the world that I had the audacity to bring children into, and I get over myself. So I thank you all. I thank you for the work you do. And I thank you for reminding me again that we are not alone in this work. And the work is being done. 400 years, when you look at it like that, it sounds like a long time. But if you look at it from the Kerner Commission, I think there was one commission over that, really, it's really not that. We are making strides. We are making strides, and the work is being done. And I wouldn't want to do it with better people than you. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you can hear me. Can everyone hear me? I guess I can't see the audience, so I'll just kind of just start and talk. First of all, I'll introduce myself, and then Chief Barnes will introduce himself. Very honored to be here today. Very honored to accept this invitation and speak with you all virtually. My name is Tariq Mcguire. I'm a Deputy Police Chief in Arlington, Texas. Just a little bit about Arlington. Arlington is between Dallas and Fort Worth, a city of a population of about 400,000 people. And so before I start today, and Chief Barnes introduces himself, just a little bit about my professional background. Not only am I approaching my 20th year in policing, but I also had some great opportunities over the years. I had an opportunity in 2016 to be a law enforcement fellow at the International Association of Chiefs of Police, where I worked with the Department of Justice, the Obama White House administration, to really work on police reform around the country. And they gave me a different perspective. Prior to that, I knew policing as it was in Arlington, Texas. But I got an opportunity to go around the United States, offer technical assistance, and to really look at police departments and see how they mirrored as it relates to the task force on 21st century policing and the 6 pillars that were identified. I will tell you that I am a consultant for the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and I also am a person that achieved a doctorate degree really looking at pattern and practice reform as it relates to reforming policing and how do we seek solutions to what the issues are. But I think it's very important that I share with you why I got into policing. As I previously stated, I'm approaching my 20th year in law enforcement. I am part of the executive staff of our police leadership team in Arlington. But I grew up on the south side of Dallas. I grew up in a two-parent household where I'm in church all the time. A very, very stern father that made sure I had a clear pathway for life. But there were two police officers in my church who I interacted with all the time and who served as role models subsequent to my parents. And I saw how they served our community. I saw how they protected our community, the values that they had. And ultimately, when I had an opportunity, I began to work at the Arlington Police Department in 2003. So I stand here today to not only just share my academic reflections, but also to share my reflections on policing through my lived experiences. And so there are challenges that we face, but I do think that we're making progress. And as it was previously stated, you know, for me, this is not a sprint. This is not something that you check the box on, right? At the end of the day, I have sons that are growing up, and I want them to inherit a society that was better than the one that I grew up in, the same way my parents were diligent for me. So hopefully, over this next few minutes, we'll be able to share some slides and collective points. Some points may have already been made, but just share our perspective as police chiefs who are currently serving in the profession. And I'll let Chief Barnes introduce himself.
Thank you, Tariq. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Sean Barnes, and I am so happy to be here at Case Western Reserve School of Law. My original path in life, I thought I was going to be a lawyer from a very young age, not because I like to talk or argue, but because I like to read. I grew up in housing projects in a small town in North Carolina. My grandmother was a domestic, and every summer she would bring home a new set of Encyclopedia Britannicas from the person that she worked with, and she would give those to me, and I would read them cover to cover. So I went to college, and I got a degree in history, pre-law, from Elizabeth City State University, a historically black college and university in northeastern North Carolina. Alex Haley is one of our esteemed alums. And I would like to tell you that I studied history because I thought that I could change the world, but it came easy to me, and I knew I could spend more time on the yard. Some of you know what that means. But nevertheless, I was a high school history teacher who found policing just kind of vicariously looking for that next step in my life. But I want to share with you that there's good news. And the good news is there are a group of law enforcement executives, mid-level and upper-level executives. We're called National Institute of Justice LEADS Scholar. And LEADS is an acronym. It means Law Enforcement Advancing Through Data and Science. And we're a part of that group, Tariq and I. There are many others throughout the country that are a part of that group. And what we do is we try to use data and science, qualitative and quantitative data, in order to inform police reform practices. So there is good news. I too am a Department of Justice consultant with US DOJ Civil Rights. We're working on a few cases now that you may have heard of, but we can't speak of. But just know that there is good work being done. My research, my original research, deals in the area of racial disparities in traffic stops. And the reason I chose that is because as a black man in America, I have been a victim of racial profiling, but as a police chief or as a police captain at the time, I had to question what my role was in this problem. And I think if we had more police leaders willing to question, how do I contribute to this? And how can I use data and science to inform decisions? I think we'd be in a much better place. So I have research in also in officer safety and wellness, qualitative study, and my first original research was in the area of technology, looking at something called predictive policing and the impact predictive policing would have on communities. I am currently the chief of police in Madison, Wisconsin, which is the capital city, and I'm very proud to be there. We have a number of, I don't want to say reforms, because that may not be what I really want to say, but we have a number of initiatives that we're focusing on that are community-led, that are evidence-based, and we think, I think, that you will see the Madison Police Department as a national model for exceptional policing. Now, I know Tariq comes from Arlington and he wants to brag on Arlington, but let me say that through my leadership and through symposiums like the one we are attending right now at Case Western Reserve University School of Law, I do believe that the Madison Police Department will be that example that the previous speaker spoke of. All right.
So we have about 9 to 10 slides that we want to go over rather quickly. And the sergeant just talked a little bit about this, but we really want to evaluate the impact of federal inventions as it relates to critical incidents in the 20th and the 21st century, and understand the impact that federal legislation had on American policing. And then I think what is most pivotal that Chief Barnes will talk about is the lessons learned from Selma, Alabama. You know, we always talk about bridging the gap in policing, and we've seen historical periods that have defined changes within our country. But I also want to tie that into this project that we're leading nationally right now that we will launch in Washington, D.C. this summer, the 54th Mile Policing Project. And so if you just bear with us for a few moments, we'd like to go through several slides and just talk about historically where we think key moments have been in policing throughout the United States and where we are at today. So Sergeant just talked about this a few minutes ago. 1968, the Kerner Commission, right? We knew that in 1967 there was national rioting as a result of impoverished communities. We saw a lot of national excessive police use of force, particularly in major cities. And then ultimately, we know that the impact was in disenfranchised communities, again, where people lack social resources and reform. And so that executive order was signed by President Lyndon Johnson, right, that established a National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders to evaluate policing and other social issues during that time period. Then in 1994, President Bill Clinton signed the Violent Crime Control Act, which gave the Department of Justice authority to go in and investigate alleged police misconduct. And I bring that to the point because a lot of times in which we know people attribute this Violent Crime Control Act to what we have saw in mass incarceration. We know that that Violent Crime Control Act also spoke about 3 strikes rule, right? That people were really arrested on their 3rd strike and given longer prison sentences that were also inequitable. But it brought a pivotal point. So identify in 1991, we know that America saw one of the most horrific national televised incidents as related to use of force when we saw Rodney King that was beaten by the LAPD. And so subsequent to that, again, a good point from this legislation outside of what we know that were bad points of legislation was that it gave the Department of Justice the authority through Section 14141 to begin to enact federal consent decrees as it relates to law enforcement. And then, as I stated previously, in 2016, which started in 2015, President Obama signed Executive Order 13688, right, which established a national task force that was called the Task Force on 21st Century Policing. Again, we see a pivotal issue in our country where we saw civil unrest as related to an African American being shot, not actually shot, but there was an African American that was actually shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri. Now, there are some interesting factors that came out of the Department of Justice investigation in Ferguson. Outside of what happened with Michael Brown, we also saw that there were inequities, racial inequities, as related to fines and how the city of Ferguson, again, treated Black and brown communities. But a good thing that came out of that was the 6 pillars on 21st century policing. And I won't go through all of them, but more specifically, Pillar 1 and Pillar 6 has a profound impact on policing. Pillar 1 focuses on building trust and legitimacy between law enforcement and communities. And then Pillar 6 that focuses on officer safety and wellness. And why are those important? Because if police do not have the trust of the community, then I believe that it reduces the likelihood of officer safety. And so we know that when police do the right thing, when they treat people with equity and fairness, that the outcomes are more favorable for community health. Then most recently, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which was not passed. It really proposed comprehensive legislation surrounding police accountability and trying to address not only the overall culture of policing, but also empower communities to address systemic issues centered around racism and bias. It focused on trying to establish a national standard for police departments. I think the sergeant talked about this a few moments earlier. You know, I've traveled all around the country, and again, I would like to think that police departments operate in the same way. But the most important reasoning why it is important for there to be collective efficacy in trying to address these issues is that police departments police the way, or should police the way that their communities desire. We are the United States of America. We do not have a national police force. Police forces are catered to communities in the areas that they serve, and that's what we should reflect. And so the last thing that I will just say on this slide is that it focused on the reprogrammed funding to invest in transforming community-based policing programs. And while the conversation around defunding policing can really be argumentative or be very subjective, in my experience when I've traveled throughout the United States, what I've heard from communities are that really police are important to them. They want police around, but they want to be policed in the fashion that is constitutionally sound. But ultimately, people also are looking for their local governments to reinvest in communities where there have been challenges for years to bring up those equity environments to create fairness and what we would like to see through economic progress. So I'll transition this conversation to Chief Barnes to really kind of center the focus on what we're trying to do right now and to talk about can policing be transformational.
Absolutely. I think policing can be transformative, but we all need to understand one very serious fact is that reform, change, leadership is necessary, but it's also dangerous. And there are a lot of things that can happen along the way, and you have to be resolute in doing that. It's important to realize that there are about 18,000 police departments in the U.S. The average size of a police department is about 5 to 25 officers. In Arlington, they have about 700 police officers, and in Madison, we have about 500. We're notwithstanding. Most of the police departments are very, very small. So when you talk about collaborative reform and the role of law on policing, you have to remember that. Because if you're asking for a reform that they cannot afford, that they don't understand, you have to get at that very small micro level of policing to see that. I personally had not heard of Ferguson, Missouri, until Michael Brown. I had heard of Sanford, Florida either, even though that did not have to do with policing. I had not heard of these areas, but we know where they are now because anything can happen at any time. Collaborative solutions are certainly needed. Too many times, police departments have become the one thing that everyone focuses on. But we know that the criminal justice system, or as Herbert Packer called it, the criminal justice non-system, is based on cops, courts, and corrections. And all three need to be reformed at the same time if we are indeed to see the type of reforms that we're talking about here today. If you want to see a solution, then everyone has to come to the table. Many police agencies have adopted national standards, but communities still experience excessive use of force and lack community transformation. I will tell you that the culture in police departments is very strong and resistant to change. Let me repeat that. Cultures in police departments are very strong and will resist change. And when you have police chiefs, when you have community members that want to do things the right way, they will come under attack. It is imperative that you as lawyers or future lawyers or those who are involved in the law support those leaders who are trying to do the right thing, because you can learn just as much from a success as you can from a failure. Bridging the relationship between police and communities is important now more than ever. We'll talk more about that. So, why don't we say bridging? Tariq had an opportunity to go to Selma, Alabama, and he had an opportunity to take his two small children across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And while there, he began to understand and research about what exactly happened on that bridge. And I think it's one of those things in history that most of us know about, but we haven't had an opportunity to simply learn about. We know some of the more famous names, but do you know the name of Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was shot unarmed by an Alabama state trooper who was simply following orders at that particular time? Now, events today are nationally televised, which affects the consciousness of America. We could probably all remember where we were on 9/11 and what we were thinking. Consequently, we can probably remember where we were when we saw the George Floyd incident. But we didn't see or didn't understand what happened on that bridge with Jimmy Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old deacon who was shot trying to protect his family, his mother, his wife, and a small child. National legislation and federal support is needed to help enact use of force changes within our country. We need attorneys to push forward for federal legislation. And if you can't do that, then what you do is you say, if you want federal grant dollars, whether it's community development, whether it's something that has to do with transportation, if you want federal dollars, your police department must be enacting these particular reforms. Tariq spoke earlier about the President's 21st Century Task Force on Police. My only criticism of that report, and I was a part of Pillar 6, Officer Safety and Wellness, my only criticism is, why was that report not attached to grant funding? It is now. We received a grant in Madison to hire 6 officers specifically for Pillar 1, trust and legitimacy. Those officers cannot be used for enforcement. We can't use them for traffic. We can't use those officers for anything other than building trust and legitimacy. And so my thought with those officers is to do something around adverse childhood experiences. Oftentimes, police are the first persons to see outside of family a child that experiences, witnesses, or is a victim of a trauma. It's our responsibility to connect that child with services. So I intend to use my officers for Pillar 1 to help bridge that gap to decrease the ACE score of children in Madison. After the death of George Floyd, which we talked about, myself, Tariq, and another one of our police leaders, Dr. Obed Madney, who's now in Las Vegas, but originally from Sacramento, we traveled to Selma, Alabama. We actually spent the day at Brown AME Chapel. We met with Pastor Leo Strong. We got an opportunity to look through archives and stand at the diocese where so many great civil rights leaders stood and reflect on where we really are with this issue of police-community relations. We know that at that time they were trying to raise the consciousness of America by walking 54 miles from Selma to Montgomery. And the following day, Tariq, myself, and Obed started walking. And it took us about 3 days, but we walked from Selma to Montgomery. And along that area, along that travel, we began our journey of self-discovery. We are 3 black men who live in America. Please don't think that because we wear a uniform and a badge, we don't live in the same America that we grew up in. And so we had an opportunity to see people who stopped by to talk to us while we were walking, white, black, male, female, police officers, truckers, who offered support, who offered guidance, who told us continue to tell your story, continue to fight for us, because we need more people in law enforcement like us. And so along the way, we began to take photos and cell phone videos and camera footage and things of that nature. And what came out of it was an opportunity to create a small, short documentary that we're going to premiere this summer at the National Police Memorial Fund Museum. Because experiences like that, they have to be shared. And we're, it's no cost to it. We're not trying to sell anything. But it's just an example of the work that's being done. And every time I see the film, it helps me out a lot. And so we're developing a curriculum that will be focused on the lessons that we learn and lessons that are learned from Selma about communication and building a pathway forward This is really, I think, the first curriculum of its kind to share the experiences of African Americans on an incident in this country. There's curriculums around the Holocaust Museum that police departments can go through, which helps them out tremendously. But this will be the first, I think, to demonstrate a lesson, a historical lesson, and then a current perspective about that. Tariq, did you want to say anything about the law before we take questions?
No, I think, you know, I can tell you this. You know, in the city of Arlington, we had 30 days of protests after George Floyd. We have a very supportive community in the city of Arlington, and we work to try to improve the entire community on a daily basis. But going to Selma and walking 2.5 days, 20 miles a day was very transformational for us. And 3 things came out of that experience when we reflected on it. Number one is I see you. You know, when you talk about, as the sergeant just talked about earlier, Blue Lives Matter, I think that we as a country have defined ourselves through hashtags and self-expression that way. But people were saying 3 things to us. I see you, right? We want you to acknowledge what has happened. We as a community, we as a nation must acknowledge what the issue is. The second thing is I hear you. I hear you really means that we must follow with some type of action. We used to talk about building trust in communities. Now we think that people, and we know that people want accountability and transparency before you can even talk about building trust. And the last thing is we're in this together. You know, we know what the problem is, but I'm in a state and age now as it relates to my law enforcement career where I'm focused on solutions to create a better society again for my children. And so we hope that this is going to be nationally put out. We hope to seek federal support behind the film through the BJA and other entities. And we hope that you will support it. And again, we're honored and look forward to answering questions after the next presentation.
Professor Futterman.
Professor Harwood. It's a late fall afternoon. I'm about to quit work for the day when my phone rings. And it's someone from within law enforcement in Chicago who's calling asking me for some help. They tell me about a police shooting. 2 officers had driven up on a 17-year-old boy who had a small knife in his hand. Within seconds of jumping from the car, one of the officers shoots the boy as he shies away from the officer toward a construction fence in an abandoned industrial area in the city. The officer pauses as the boy falls to the ground, then adjusts his aim, and he empties his magazine into the boy's body as the boy lay on the street writhing in pain. 16 shots. They tell me it looks like an execution. He shot that boy like he was a dog on the street. And it was big. They're worried, and they're calling me because they're worried that the shooting was already being covered up at this point, like so many others. And they please help me do something to keep this from getting bigger. We gotta put a stop to this mess. The boy's name was Juan McDonald. That call, folks, led to a series of events that created conditions for the greatest opportunity for transformational change in my lifetime. Good afternoon. I guess there's no, on Zoom land, I guess there's no response, but good afternoon, y'all.
Good afternoon.
All right. What's the good today on Friday? Thank you for bearing with me. Well, y'all, just a couple of weeks ago, I got another call. And this time I was about to leave the country with my wife for a much, much needed vacation. And this call was from Brian Adams. He told me about this amazing symposium on a matter that's so central to who I am, what I do. He asked me if there's any way I could throw him out. And if it was anyone other than Brian, there'd be no way I didn't think about it. I never even think about trying to do something such a short turnaround just after I returned to the country. But it was Brian Anderson, so I had to find some way to be here, albeit virtually. I consider it an honor to be with y'all, and thank you for your kind introduction, Professor Harwood. I know y'all know this, but the city of Cleveland and Case Western Reserve Law School is blessed to have someone like Brian Adamson there. He is someone who I consider to be a mentor, teacher of teachers, and someone who's tirelessly fought against injustice wherever it is. So I promised today that I promised Brian that I simply wouldn't talk about problems. And in return, he put me on this panel called Solutions. But I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver, but I promise Brian and I promise y'all here that I'll offer at least one solution that confronts the reality of racist and violent policing. To get police to stop harassing, beating, and killing so many Black folks, so that we're not playing Marvin Gaye and having this conversation again 50 years later. So to help me to do so, let me first take you back to that confidential call just a few years back. That call about the police execution of Paul McDonald came to me in the context of a couple of things. First, it came in the context of decades of utter police impunity in Chicago, documented history of torture of Black men in police interrogation rooms, decades of racism, brutality, false arrest, denial. Second, the call came in the context of a civil rights clinic that I directed at UC Law School that focuses on race and police accountability, the clinic that Professor Harvey told me all about. And for the past 22 years or so, my law students and I have been working alongside individuals and families in Chicago who've been most impacted by police abuse. Now that call, however, it wasn't the first thing that I heard about the shooting of Paul McDonald. Indeed, I remember reading a blotter in the press just a couple weeks earlier, shortly after Paul had been killed, and it presented a really different story from what that caller told me. And it read like hundreds of others, and I'll quote to you from it. Quote, squad car responded to a call someone was trying to break into a car in an industrial area. Officers found the boy with a knife in the street. He ignores their commands to drop the knife. He lunged at the officer with a knife, putting the officer in fear for his life. The officer shot him once in self-defense. End quote. Sound familiar? Stories like these appeared several times a month in Chicago media, and the basic elements were pretty much the same. Black person shot by the police on the scene say the shooting is justified, then the authorities rely on 3 words to deflect any further inquiry. Y'all know those words. It's under investigation. The internal investigation operates as a critical part of the city's machinery of denial, reifying the official narrative. They proceed quietly outside of public view, often take a couple years or more, designed to lead to a common result. And indeed, in the 7 years leading up to Laquan's killing, Chicago police officers killed more than 400 people. Let me say it again, killed on an average of more than 1 person a week. More than 75% of the people killed by police in Chicago are Black. None of those killings were ever found to be unjustified. So back to that phone call. I had lots and lots of questions for the caller, and while I never saw them, they were disappointed. They want me to do it frame by frame over the phone. And my students and I began to investigate. We began to go out to the scene, try to investigate what happened. We partnered with a long-time collaborator, a writer by the name of Jamie Calvin. Again, we go to the scene, we walk through what the confidential informant told me, we take photos, we map out events, we hire a private investigator to work with us, and we interview a number of witnesses to the killing. Everything the source told me checks out. Completely different reality from the narrative that the police department shared with the public. And now this is back in December 2014, post-Ferguson, after Ferguson. And while at this time there's national attention to police killing of Black people, no one at this point is talking about Paul McDonald. He was awarded a state. There are a few people beyond some family members, a few family members and us, who are raising questions about the high school student Scott. We're next able to get a copy of Laquan's autopsy from another confidential source. And contrary to that official narrative, single shot in self-defense, we learned that Laquan was shot 16 times. Just again, like the source told. We chart where each gunshot would enter the boy's body and share our findings with the public, and again, we call for the release of the truth, the release of the truth. Major media begin to take some notice of what we're doing now. But their notice only went so far because it wasn't major media, but Brandon Smith was this young independent journalist inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement, who had the courage to actually hire us, and then attorney Matt Topic hired us, and use loosely pro bono for free, to take the city to court, to sue the city to release this video. Shame the devil, tell the truth. 13 months, city stood fast behind its official story,
Just another justified shooting by the police by a police officer for self-defense. Until we won that court that required the city to actually release this video to the people. At this point, y'all, I'm sure remember the Chicago becomes a leading national story. Protests engulfed Chicago's magnificent mile on Black Friday, big shopping day of the year. Young black folks used to that video of a police officer firing those 16 shots into the body of a 17-year-old boy as he lay bleeding in the street, contributed to a national awakening to the reality of police abuse in black and brown communities and the code of silence that protects it. We didn't simply expose the horrific execution of a black child at the hands of a police officer, but what we helped to expose was the routine machinery through which the police department hid and justified systemic violence against black people. The whole world at this point is taking notice. After we forced the police department to release that video, guess what? The local prosecutor has no choice but to file criminal charges against Officer Jason Van Dyke. Charges were filed the exact same day the video becomes public. Another way of saying this or looking at this is that the state's attorney, that's what we call prosecutors in Chicago, the state's attorney never charged Jason Van Dyke for any of those 16 shots captured on video until the day before said video would be released. So we later filed a successful petition to appoint a special prosecutor, independent of the local state's attorney, to prosecute Vaughn's murder and the cover-up. And as y'all know, this results in the murder conviction of Jason Van Dyke, the Chicago police officer who fired those 16 shots into Vaughn's body. This was the very first time ever in Chicago that an on-duty Chicago police officer had ever been held criminally accountable for killing a black person. About 7 years ago, I convened a small group of Chicago civil rights, some leading civil rights advocates. And we met with Tom Perret, who at the time, Tom headed the Civil Rights Division, to discuss our petition for DOJ intervention in Chicago. And Tom was joined by one of our former students who was then serving as one of President Obama's chief advisors. Chicago Police Department at this time was using at least as many black people with the same or greater degree of impunity as they were at the time that we forced the public release of the video of the police murder of Juan McDonald. But despite many of the well-meaning folk in the White House, DOJ, they just kind of shrugged. And they apologetically told us, my former student as well, that they simply couldn't afford to tackle something as big as Chicago. Even President Obama didn't have the will to try to take on the Herculean task of addressing police abuse in his adopted hometown, until he was forced to do so about 7 years later. And over those 7 years, because those 7 years mattered, those 7 years really, really mattered. Over those 7 years until we won the release of that video, more than 350 people were killed by Chicago police. Thousands of black people were beaten. Many more were wrongly arrested and prosecuted. So in late 2015, as the entire world was transfixed on Chicago and this execution of the 17-year-old boy, we petitioned the DOJ again. We got to come to Chicago. And this time, the DOJ has no choice but to finally respond to our years-long promise. They then launched the largest civil rights investigation in the history of the DOJ. And in December 2016, the very tail end of the Obama presidency, the DOJ issues its investigative findings that document what black folks in Chicago's community have viscerally known for decades: Chicago Police Department's systemic abuse of black and brown folks. It also announces that it had entered a written agreement with the mayor to negotiate a binding consent decree that would result in federal oversight of the police department. But, however, after documenting CPD's pattern of practice of brutality and discrimination, DOJ did something equally historic. Walked away. With Trump concessions in, federal oversight of the CPD down. So once again, it took the people in the community to step up. And this time, so it was Black Lives Matter Chicago, the Urban League, the NAACP, Latinx neighborhood organizations, women's advocacy groups, and others who've been most impacted by police abuse across the political spectrum. And we do what Trump and his Justice Department refused to do, and that's enforce the Constitution of the United States of America. And together we bring a community-based legal challenge to the police department's unchecked pattern and practice of brutality in Black, brown, and poor communities. We seek what's called a permanent injunction, the appointment of an independent monitor, and federal judicial oversight of the Chicago Police Department. An injunction enforceable by the people who've been most impacted by police abuse, kind of injunctions that both chiefs, Mcguire and Barnes are working on present in other states. The problem, though, is that the U.S. Supreme Court in 1983, in a case called Lyons versus City of Los Angeles, robbed people who have been most impacted by systemic police abuse the right to sue police departments for change. While folks may sue the police for money, the Supreme Court stripped victims of police misconduct before it even asked the court to order the police department to stop violating their rights, much less ask the court to order the police to actually change what they're doing. And as our Chicago experience had long proved, the police department would rather pay hundreds of millions of dollars to police misconduct victims than actually be forced to change what they do. And indeed, Chicago's paid in excess of $500 million as a result of police abuse in the last 10 years alone. Lyons' case was about a young Black man's attempt in LA to stop the LAPD from putting Black folks in chokeholds, often killing them. And after the LAPD actually choked this young man, Adolph Lyons, choked him unconscious, broke his larynx, all for the serious crime of driving to burn down Tower. Black men stopped by LAPD 20 times more likely to be choked than a white man. The Supreme Court bill said, tough luck, Mr. Lyons. You can sue LAPD for money, not for change. In the nearly 40 years since Lyons came down, federal courts have repeatedly dismissed lawsuits by people, ordinary people, people who have experienced seeking change, people trying to sue police for injunctive relief. So as a result, back to Chicago, the mayor and CPD knew, shoot, they could continue to fight court-ordered change in Chicago. And they did. That was until we persuade actually the state, the Illinois State Attorney General to join our fight, created another national precedent. This is one of the first times in U.S. history that a state attorney general ever brought a federal civil rights case seeking to enjoin a pattern of civil rights violations by local law enforcement. You see, unlike people in the community harmed by these practices, the government, as both chiefs were just talking about, under that statute, 42 U.S.C. 14141, the 1994 statute, the government generally has the power to sue the police department for court-ordered change, but typically these lawsuits have been brought by the federal. So the state agency's intervention in Chicago did prove to be the straw that broke, needed to break the mayor's resistance to a decree. But also brought a new set of challenges. Because instead of joining our community led, the agency files her own lawsuit. Good news is the addition of the Illinois Attorney General brings the city to take. Bad news is case was excluded from the community. We're not allowed to be in the room where it happens. Instead of the community leading effort, the consent decree negotiations devolved into becoming a two-party negotiation between the mayor and the agent, political incentives. Notwithstanding Donald Trump, notwithstanding the police union's efforts, and there were some strong efforts by the FOP, Fraternal Order Police, to fight court oversight in Chicago, backed by the Trump administration. So not just 180 can be changed, not just advocating the responsibility, but actively opposing any federal oversight of the police department in Chicago. Notwithstanding that, the city negotiates a consent decree that incorporates at least some of the stuff that people have been fighting for. In early 2019, just a few years ago, after an extended public hearing, the U.S. federal judge actually approves the decree. We won a consent decree in Chicago. But what's more, and this is historic, because we won the power to enforce the decree in court. And when I say we, I'm talking about that same coalition who brought that community-based lawsuit. We won the power to enforce the CPD consent decree in court, direct line to independent monitor, federal judge for what could be the next decade or more. This is the first time that community enforcement has ever been written into government consent decree with the police in the United States. However, and I'll try to get to the point. Decree falls short in a number of foundational ways. Why? Because it excludes the people most affected from bargaining. And while the decree granted the community coalition these enforcement powers that I just raved about, it denied the community coalition party status along with the right to the kind of discovery that would enable folks to serve as effective guardians and monitors of the decree.
So that means the community remains on the outside looking in, while the CPD continues to resist change. No surprise. Chicago's experience with consent decrees, federal consent decrees, sparked me because no doubt DOJ decrees have led to some meaningful reforms in police departments around the nation. Their ability to actually change what's happening on the ground has been severely limited from a common fundamental law present in every one of these decrees, the exclusion of the community. DOJ-driven processes meant people who've been most impacted by police policies and practices, people most knowledgeable about the problems on the ground, lack the legal power to actually meaningfully participate in these cases. And indeed, I'm not aware of a single instance in which a community organization, much less an actual victim of this misconduct, has been allowed to actually intervene as a party in a civil rights pattern and practice that is brought by the DOJ. Community orgs and actual victims of police misconduct have been consistently excluded from occupying any empowered seat at the table during the legal process. Like us, they don't get to be new Americans. And like us in Chicago, the folks most impacted by police practices are denied the power to access the information they need to serve as effective monitors, denied discovery rights in the system, and the very system in terms of how it best succeeds in resisting change is by the ability to control information, by secrecy, by denial, by lying, by denying people on the ground the very information that folks need to call on. And so the results are pretty unsurprising. By excluding folks who know the most about the nature and cause of the disease and denying the power to do something about it, we get remedies that fall short. Remedies that may attack the symptoms, but often fail to address the underlying causes of police impunity in Black and brown communities. So let me end with my promise of not now obvious solution. Just as it gave the U.S. Attorney General in 1994, Congress must enact new civil rights legislation, a new civil rights law that expressly gives people injured by police policies and practices the legal standing, the legal power to actually seek injunctive and declaratory relief to end those unconstitutional practices. The power to stop this mess. And folks, it's our job to make this happen. If there is one thing that I've learned in my 22 years in the clinic, it's that things don't change by themselves. They change only when we make them change. Thank you for giving me this time.
First, let me thank all of the speakers for a really good session, and let me thank my friends and colleagues, Brian Adams and Aisha Hardaway, for putting together such a wonderful program. I have a specific question for Professor Futterman, and it goes to your last suggestion about having Congress pass legislation that would give members of the community the ability to seek injunctive relief. Putting aside the political challenges of getting such legislation enacted, what are the prospects that the Supreme Court would uphold such a provision in the wake of its restrictive approach to standing in the TransUnion case a few years ago, which said that Congress is limited in the extent to which it can create causes of action?
I could only hear part of that, but a couple things that I thought I heard is one, the question goes to, will the Supreme Court fix this? Heck no, we know how. Now this Supreme Court is not going to overturn lines. In terms of Congress's ability, in terms of its power and its constitutional power to enact something like this, it's the exact same power that Congress had and did indeed exercise back as Chief Mcguire and Chief Barnes were speaking back in 1994 in giving the federal government, the Attorney General, the power to bring these kinds of suits. So I have, and there's a short question, is there any question about the constitutionality and ability, putting aside politics, and that's a big thing to put aside, that Congress has the power to do, but there's no doubt that Congress has the power to do this. And the reality is, because I've also lived a life and so many folks who've come before me and taught me and showed me this about just every time when someone says, can't be done, or at least you see it's down on the cell, nothing's happening with that, can't be done, won't be done. People who came before me and in my lifetime have built a legacy on every time somebody said you can't do this. And so I'm not about king. And this is what we need to do. And what we need to do is the right thing, the moral thing to do, and that's to give people who've been very most impacted by these policies and practices. It's just like oversight for police. The power to actually do something, not just to sue police departments for money and to sue police departments for lots and lots of money, but actually the power to have a hand in a real and powerful hand in doing what's necessary and forcing the kind of changes that are necessary, being at the table.
I don't know if there was another question, but Professor Futterman, I'd love to talk with you a little bit about this. So to the extent that Congress isn't going to pass new legislation, regardless of what the Supreme Court would do with it, I wrote a piece a couple of years ago about creating a seat at the table for litigation, such as much like what you're talking about. And it talks about how I believe the circuit courts across the country have gotten the adequately represented standard wrong as it relates only to, guess who? Impacted communities trying to intervene into 14141 or what's now 12601, right, litigation. And there is precedent, right, in the immigration context and in the environmental context, right, where individuals are able to say, the federal government does not adequately represent my interests, and because of that, I must be a party to this litigation. We know that courts have allowed police unions to intervene in 14141 actions in a handful of times across the country, but not once ever have. And so I know part of what you're thinking about with the injunctive relief is also, the purse and the change, if you will. But I just wanted to, number one, bring that to your attention because I think in response to my esteemed colleague Dean Itten's question, right, there might be an opportunity to have some circuit success, right, with the right case. Now, what happens if it's appealed to the Supreme Court? Who knows? But by that time, hopefully the litigation is done and the people have been at the table. The other thing I wanted to just ask you about sort of your on-the-ground impression of how things are going in Chicago now, right? So 1980s, 1990s, we see the atrocities under the leadership of John Burge, right, and his torture. And I remember a colleague of ours at a conference saying, we just couldn't believe, it was so horrendous. No one believed, right, that could have been happening. And I said, no one believed. You mean people in power didn't believe, right? Black people always know what was happening to our family members, our loved ones, and to our bodies, right? So and then fast forward and we have Laquan McDonald, and it takes you in your clinic getting, right, this secret telephone call to have you start to pick away and pull at this thread to reveal to the nation what actually happened to that young man. And I'm just wondering, now that's been, 8 years, my math is bad, right? That's 8 years ago. I'm wondering if you get the sense that on the streets in Chicago, whether or not folks are still reverting back to the we just can't believe as it relates to what's happening in community, because we know that the Chicago Police Department is still the Chicago Police Department. And so I'm just wondering if folks are seeing them for who they are, or are we still back at a place of we just can't believe it?
Well, is this always this transformational moment or potentially transformational moment, and one step forward and then often 2 steps back. On the heels of President Obama and President Trump. On the heels of nationwide protests, probably the greatest social change movement in this nation ever, following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. If you look now, what was the present conversation in politics about passing criminal reform law? That had a lot of appetite. The pushback is all about the violence. What I can, and back to, we can't take our eyes off the sparrow on the old Martin Luther King quote about the arc of the moral universe. But in terms of stuff that, I mean, a really quick thumbnail in terms of what's changed, what hasn't. Good news so far. I mean, the best news is that, so I shared that at the time when Jason Van Dyke killed Laquan McDonald, police in Chicago were averaging killing someone, more than one person a week. Still killing far too many people, but it's about a quarter of what they were killing before. Use of reported force is also down about a third from what it was. So the actual scrutiny, the actual opening up to the police to public scrutiny is mattering, and it's changing behavior. One thing that hasn't changed, and one thing that hasn't changed at all, is who are the victims and survivors of police abuse. To this day, and on at least a 10-to-1 ratio, who's being beaten by the police, who's being subject to force, Black folks. Hasn't changed. And in terms of the lessons that one would hope that we would learn, particularly in Chicago, for the release of the video and hoping back to release the video of the killing of Laquan McDonald. I won't share the story, but y'all can take a look at a horrific police raid that became public last December of a Black social worker in Chicago, in which she was naked when 12 armed officers came in at gunpoint, held her naked, wrong home, wrong bad raid. And then, just as Laquan McDonald, new political administration hid the video, lied, and continued not to tell the truth about what happened again this raid for us. So the state of trust in police still remains in Chicago, particularly in Black communities, at pretty much an all-time low. And as a result, also police have been, and as violence has went up with COVID, police have been feckless when it comes to being able to solve violent crime, investigate. Without that trust, it's a near impossibility. Lastly, community still remains on the outside looking in, and what's obvious from the stuff that I've said is that, sadly, so while there's been some progress, it's been really slow progress, and what we've seen more than anything else is still a police department in denial, and a police department that is actively resisting change, led by the virulently racist police union, who are big fans of the modern code.
This is more of a comment or a solution. It's not that they did not know what was going on. They knew what was going on, but the powers that be, that's why it's called his story. It was his story. But now that we have started doing pushback, not just Black people, but people of all nationalities and colors and everything, they came out and marched and taking a knee. Oh my God, who took a knee and was quiet about, like, taking a knee was so offensive, but what Derek Chauvin did, taking a knee on George Floyd's neck, they feel like that's a comparison. There's no comparison, and it's no longer can they gaslight us and make us think that it's our imagination.
Well, I want to thank everybody for spending the day. This has really, really fed my soul. I know it is a heavy haul to be in one place all day long, and so I don't count it lightly that you guys chose to be with us today.